Does the world need another Stranger Things video essay? Probably not, yet here's another. I've been thinking about why I find this show so compelling, and I realized it's because it uses traditional storytelling techniques creatively without feeling the need to reinvent the wheel. So this video will look at the pop hit show through the lens of storytelling. What it does well, which is really a lot, and what it does poorly, and there's plenty of that too. We'll start by going through most of the characters, then the basic infrastructure of each season, before moving on to just a few key story themes, and finally a few broad strengths and weaknesses of the show. Depending on how they wrap up in Season 5, Stranger Things definitely has the potential to be a long-lasting cultural fixture, and it takes more than trending popularity to do that. It's the type of story I wish I could see at a drive-in theater, and that's not just because it's set in the 80s, but also because despite its seemingly complicated story world and huge cast of characters, it's actually a pretty simple story. But before jumping in, I want to very quickly look at the hero's journey according to Joseph Campbell. It's not the be-all, end-all rule of storytelling, but it is a helpful frame of reference as we unpack the structure of each season and look closely at the characters. The hero's journey is really a metaphor for the deep inner journey of transformation that heroes in all times and places, fiction and real, seem to share. There's a full circle from ordinary world to special world and back again, and the steps are broken down into 3 acts. Act 1, the ordinary world, the call to adventure, refusing the call, meeting with the mentor, crossing the first threshold. Act 2, tests, allies, enemies, approach to the inmost cave, ordeal, reward. Act 3, the road back, resurrection, return with elixir. Familiar stories like Star Wars follow this path very closely, and considering that Star Wars and other classic tales serve as an inspiration for Stranger Things, it's not surprising at all that Stranger Things often puts its 2 primary heroes through this journey.
Halloween.
Sure is, but right now it's breakfast, okay?
Jim Hopper. So, Hopper was the first character the Duffer Brothers had in mind, and that makes a lot of sense considering he's one of the only characters who has a genuine arc and can truly be considered a hero. He's a cop, but he manages to be an outlaw hero, not just because he frequently breaks the law, but also because his primary obstacle, his primary battle, is mostly against institutions, the government, and the Hawkins lab, later the Soviet government. When we meet Hopper, he's disgruntled, drinking, smoking, actively disinterested in the town, and dismissive of Joyce. But he's smart, and by the 2nd episode of Season 1, we know he had a daughter who died, making this quest to find Will layered with trauma and meaning for him. For Hopper, the ordinary world, his starting point, is his depressed state of apathy, represented by disregard for his own personal health and Joyce's panic. Food helps convey meaning here as he eats donuts and drinks at all times of day, but we'll eventually see him taking care over what he eats when he becomes Elle's father. His call to adventure is Joyce, demanding action over her missing son, and like a true hero, he initially refuses this call, dismissing her as some crazy, oversensitive mother. However, once he visits the lab and realizes they're hiding something, he accepts this great call to adventure, and crosses the threshold when he breaks into the lab alone. But in all his action and adventure, the journey he's really on is actually an internal one. As he's confronted with Joyce's desperate, helpless love for Will, he's forced to reckon with his own desperate, helpless love for Sarah, his deceased daughter. It's Hopper who ultimately finds Will, and as he gives CPR, he has active flashbacks to the death of his daughter. His voyage back to the ordinary world, leaving the Upside Down, and empowered with the elixir of compassion and engagement with the people around him, is completed when he assumes responsibility for Eleven, adopting a new daughter and accepting the role of father again. In Season 2, he has to adapt from being a maverick who answers to no one, to suddenly answering to Elle, someone who cares if he's home late or if he listens well. Sadly, however, in Season 3, all of that beautiful development is ruined. There's plenty already out there on why Season 3 Hopper is a problem, but in brief, he's a weirdly controlling misogynist to both Eleven and Joyce. He treats Joyce like the crazy lady he did in Season 1, Episode 1, except this time he also feels entitled to her affection. It seems like they didn't have a plan for him, so they just took the opportunity to incorporate as many Han Solo and Indiana Jones references as possible. He dies for the greater good in a classic heroic sacrifice, but look, just because a character goes down in a sudden flash of glory doesn't mean they had any sort of development or narrative, and it certainly doesn't mean they're redeemed. Worst of all, there was no catalyst for this weird Hopper. He ends season 2 on a beautiful, strong point, asking Mike for understanding, if not forgiveness, for hiding Elle, and opening up to Elle about his own struggles. And then he just suddenly sucks. The letter he left for Elle is beautiful, and far more true to his character than anything else from that season. But his reckoning with his own guilt, another sort of shadow form of his own self in season 4, is a marked improvement, and having Dimitri as a shapeshifter ally really helps him open up to us. It's heartbreaking to hear that his daughter's death doesn't just haunt him because she died. He also feels he was responsible because of his exposure to Agent Orange. If you need any more proof that Hopper is one of our two heroes, look up the letter he wrote to Elle. It's basically a roadmap to the entire thesis of the show, tying together themes from season 1 all the way to Vecna's curse. He basically says life is hard, it's painful, but feeling that pain is a good thing, because it means you're actually living your life, and life can be happy and beautiful. It's really good. Read it.
I can fight.
Better than any of us.
Okay, moving on to 11. While it might seem like Mike is the hero of season 1, he mostly functions as a foil to 11's development. He represents us, the audience, as we discover the depths of the supernatural unknown, but in symmetrical contrast, 11 slowly discovers the wonders of the ordinary. Think like Ariel from The Little Mermaid or Miranda from The Tempest. Their brave new worlds are our plain and mundane. Her hero's journey in season 1 mirrors Hopper's very closely in that she too is like a lone wolf who completes the journey by discovering friendship and compassion, but she does so by venturing into regular suburban life. Her moments of growth all revolve around learning friendship and loyalty from the boys. She needs to see Mike jump off the cliff to protect Dustin, so she can become the girl who sacrifices herself to the Demogorgon to protect all of them at the end of the season. We see her kill many, many people in cold blood, and she doesn't seem remotely bothered by the death of that really nice hamburger guy whose name I forget. But she demonstrates sincere compassion and care for Will and Joyce. In season 2, her journey is into her own past, finding her mother and having that just god-awful, horrible episode, The Lost Sister. But the Lost Sister does act as a mentor and helps 11 advance her powers. When 11 realizes her friends are in trouble, she has to make that classic decision that Luke Skywalker does in The Empire Strikes Back. Do I stay with my mentor and learn more, or do I go save my friends? Obviously, she heads back to Hawkins and saves the day just in time, this time empowered with greater knowledge about herself and as a more independent kid. Her highlight and most interesting arc in season 3 is bonding with Max, who helps her deal with weirdo Hopper and immature Mike, while she has to confront the Mind Flayer, which is the first real challenge to 11's powers that we've seen, and everything escalates there in a very clear way. I was, however, a little disappointed that in season 4, we never see Elle overcome her crisis of suddenly not having powers. She's got a lot to deal with, from bullies to the supposed death of her father, and it would have been nice if she had to process all of that by discovering who she is outside of her powers. Instead, she is once again tortured by Dr. Brenner, and confronted with her traumatic memories until she does regain her power. But here, her moment of triumph isn't necessarily getting her powers back, but rather refusing to forgive Dr. Brenner as he dies and begs for forgiveness. Like good old Luke Skywalker again, or Harry Potter, she has a lifelong antagonist villain in the form of Vecna, who is another version of herself, and it's clear that in season 5 she'll have to confront this shadow, this mega villain. Her journey in season 4 matches the hero's journey almost exactly, from the unknown, strange world of her own memories to the antagonistic mentor of Dr. Brenner and the shape-shifting betrayal of Vecna, whom she later confronts at the climax. Her journey home is literal, back to her home in Hawkins, and burdened with severe injuries of Max, but rewarded with happy reunions and heightened powers. One clue that Hopper and Elle are the only two true heroes to this story is that they are the only characters with fleshed out backstories right from the get-go. Some supporting characters like Max and Eddie also have hints of backstory, but for our heroes, their entire lives actually matter for both the plot and their internal journey. I have much more to say about both of them, especially 11 when we get to season 4, but for now, let's take a look at those supporting roles. As our heroes venture through the hero's journey, they encounter various character archetypes who support or challenge them along the way. Joseph Campbell was inspired by psychologist Carl Jung, who believed in universal images and themes across all cultures and religions. According to Jung, there are tons of mutations of archetypes that manifest in our unconscious, such as the father, the sage, and the outlaw, and each of us holds many within ourselves, though usually one particular archetype will be dominant. Campbell, though, identified 8 main character archetypes that our hero will deal with along the way. The hero, of course, the mentor, the ally, the herald, the trickster, the shapeshifter, the threshold guardian, and the shadow. Now, obviously there's a lot to unpack here, and in another video someday I'll talk more about each of these and their dramatic function within storytelling. For now though, it's just helpful to bear in mind, because more so than any other new show that I've seen recently, Stranger Things uses these archetypes to provide structure and advance the plot. So the 2 most fundamental archetypes I'll mention briefly, they are of course the hero and the shadow. As we know, the hero, which comes from the Greek root meaning to protect and to serve, will sacrifice their needs for others. The hero represents Freud's ego searching for identity and wholeness. The dramatic function of the hero is to identify with the audience, which is why you might consider Mike and 11 2 sides of one hero coin. But also growth and action, and usually sacrifice, often death. Now, the shadow is the dark side. The shadow might be a core villain or an antagonist, the difference there being that a villain likely has a disastrous goal, like defeating the hero, destroying the world, whereas an antagonist might even share a goal with the hero, but would have different conflicting methods. So in Stranger Things, both Vecna and Jason are the shadow, but Jason, who's that blonde guy in season 4, Jason is more of an antagonist than a true villain. We see threshold guardians and the bats that literally guard the gate in season 4, but also in season 1 when Elle knows where Will is, but doesn't want the boys to go there. So the archetypes are rarely static, so as I say, 11 can be our hero, but also a guardian. And she's certainly a herald when she first shows up, signaling to the boys and the audience that there's more to Will's disappearance. Likewise, Vecna is obviously our main shadow villain, but he's also a trickster when he works at the lab and tricks Elle. In a story like Stranger Things with so many moving parts, it makes sense to have the archetypes always shifting and changing. There are so many freaking characters on this show. I just had to mention the archetypes because you really can do a full rewatch of Stranger Things and see how they use familiar tropes from these archetypes in building up their flat characters. Now, what's a flat character, you ask? Well, in aspects of the novel, E.M. Forster differentiates between round and flat characters. Round characters being dynamic, complex characters that engage us emotionally, and flat characters being more fixed caricatures that are built around one idea and never really change. With some exceptions, I'd argue that most Stranger Things characters are flat, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. In his memoir on writing, Stephen King explains that over-describing a character is a problem in novels because characters should be a relatively equal mix of author's imagination and reader's imagination. That creates buy-in for the reader. You're part of the story, and your experience with the book is all the more intimate and long-lasting. In TV, obviously, not much is left to the imagination. We know what everyone looks like, from their skin color to hairstyle, not just their overall fashion sense, but each and every outfit they wear. We know how they walk, what facial expressions they make, what their laugh is, and so on. But Stranger Things manages to leave a lot up to the imagination nonetheless. We know exactly what Will looks like in season 4, but we're invited to, and we have to, imagine what he's thinking, and what he wants, and why he has such a bad haircut. At its strongest, the show lets us watch Max and Steve have a few bonding moments and lets us imagine how important they are to each other. At its weakest, the show basically breaks the fourth wall by having so many characters tell Steve and Nancy they should get back together, instead of letting chemistry and narratives do the work. Incidentally, Steve and Nancy do have chemistry, yeah, but I think the show writers know they don't actually make sense together narratively. I'm pretty sure they're just setting Steve up to die and they want it to be, like, extra sad, but we'll see. So, Stranger Things uses its flat characters to expand the story world of the show and keep things entertaining. It can be a problem at times, but for the large part it works. So, let's look at some of these non-hero flat characters. It'll be fun.
Because the last time you opened your heart, you got hurt. Owie.
Okay, let's just get Murray out of the way. He's always morally impeccable, he's shoved two couples together, he's vibrant, he's funny, he's impossibly smart. And then in season 4, on top of all of those things, he's also got action hero level fighting skills, which is handy.
Anyways, I should mention I'm now a black belt in karate.
He is one of my favorites. But in season 4, he was just a little too perfect and convenient, always meeting the plot wherever it needed him. It also made no sense that he went from being an antisocial hermit in the woods, like this grumpy Yoda who didn't like visitors, to flying all the way to Russia for an extreme prison breakout over someone he's just met. And to me, it seems like they knew he was a fan favorite, they didn't have a need for him this season, so they just sent him with Joyce and made it work. He performs most regularly as a mentor or threshold guardian, and in season 4, he's certainly an ally.
And I'll go, you stay. Are you kidding me? He's my son, Hop. My son.
Joyce Byers! Okay, I think there's certainly an argument to be made that Joyce is just as much of a protagonist in season 1 as Eleven or Hopper. She's led into this bizarre world by nothing but her love for Will and her own intuition, and she certainly goes through clearly progressive phases in discovering that world akin to a hero's journey. She has a really telling moment also when they build a sensory deprivation tank for Eleven to find Will using her powers in season 1. I really expected her to just really be focused on Will and not really care so much about Elle, but no, she's incredibly sweet, comforting, and praising Elle, and assuring her that she can leave at any time. So she's the mother, and she's a good mother, and she's a good person in a heroic way. But she's pretty much flat throughout the entire show, and look, don't get me wrong, I love her, and I don't think that's a problem at all, especially given Winona Ryder's unbelievable performance. But it does become a problem in season 4. Look, the Duffer Brothers have explained that they've always been fascinated by the ordinary meets extraordinary. In this case, a small suburban town meeting the horrors of the upside down in the lab. I think they used Joyce really well with this theme in season 1, answering this what if a young boy went missing in the paranormal and could only tell his mom that he's still alive. Well, this mom just crushes it. She's terrified and she's confused and spiraling out, but she's incredibly brave and assertive and persistent nonetheless. And it's that balance that makes her both admirable and relatable. We don't actually really see Will and Joyce speak until the very end of the season, so all we have to stir us emotionally is Winona Ryder showing through her manic, helpless pursuit that she deeply loves her son. And we can relate to this because, honestly, she's just a normal mom. By season 4, though, she's abandoned her kids to go hijacking planes and threatening Soviet prison guards, and she's entirely lost her frazzled local mom vibe. Characterization aside, her narrative journey in every season is the same, and it is a little repetitive. Season 1, everyone thinks Will is dead, but she senses something is up with the lights and electricity. Season 2, everyone thinks Will is fine, but she senses something is up with his weird drawings. Season 3, everyone thinks everything is fine, but she senses something is up with the magnets. Season 4, everyone thinks Hopper is dead, but she senses something is up with a mystery doll from the Soviet Union. It's a similar cycle every time, and it's pretty frustrating in season 3 when Hopper doesn't take her seriously, given that she's been right every other time. So again, she's the mother archetype with very strong hero elements.
Make it go away. But you got me, Mom.
Will Byers. Okay, Will has a very clever function in season 1. He's immediately endearing and courageous, but then when he disappears, he really disappears. He's hardly in the season, and that's a really smart choice because it makes the Upside Down truly mysterious and scary to the audience. He's gone to us, just as he's gone to all the characters, but he's out there being the hero of his own story. A key part of the hero's journey is that return home, and it's often hard for characters to come back after going through a magical or traumatic experience. And much like Frodo in Lord of the Rings cannot rest in the Shire the way his friends can, Will really can't go just back to normal, particularly in Season 2, where we see him battle himself as he's possessed. In Season 3, he has to deal with all his friends suddenly sucking, getting girlfriends, and abandoning him, and from that point on, he's pretty much just one-note miserable with a few glimmers of happiness and humor. We already know he'll be a core feature of Season 5, and I imagine that the grand battle between good and evil, Hero and Shadow, will occur within him in some way.
About 11! Get out of there! They know about 11! The bad men are coming!
Lucas Sinclair. Okay, in Season 1, Lucas's logic and reasoning balance Mike's gut instinct and faith in 11. But this logical side doesn't mean he's cold. He gears up and goes out looking for Will on his own, ultimately teaming up with his squad again to protect Elle. He successfully pursues and opens up to Max in Season 2, getting attacked by Billy along the way. He's not able to defend himself, he's a kid, and we can contrast this end of Season 2 scene to Season 4, when Jason barges in, much like Billy did. Lucas fights back, literally wrestling with the version of himself that he thought he wanted to be. Lucas has a great arc in Season 4, from choosing popularity over his friends to vice versa, and realizing he wasn't there for Max when she needed him most and holding himself accountable. He, throughout, is the perfect ally to Mike, and Mike is the perfect ally to him. I imagine that's why they had Dustin say to Mike in Season 1 that Lucas is really Mike's best friend, a line that always seemed weird to me, but I think they're intended to balance each other out more than they actually do in the show. Hopefully, we get some more of this in Season 5.
Now that you're out of high school, which means you're technically an adult, don't you think it's time you move on from primitive constructs such as popularity?
Oh, Dustin, you really carry the show sometimes. I don't care what Will says, in Season 1, Dustin is the heart of the group, pulling everyone together and negotiating between Lucas's and Mike's conflict. He makes a major idiot move in Season 2 by keeping that little monster lizard thing, but he actively atones for it by teaming up with Steve to solve the problem he's created. The Duffer Brothers clearly realized Steve and Dustin have more chemistry than any other pairing in the show, so in Season 3 he barely interacts with his main squad at all, but it works. He brings out a nurturing brotherly side to Steve that not even Steve knew about, and in Season 4, Dustin gets a new mentor in Eddie. And though Steve has taught Dustin how to be more confident, Eddie teaches him that he can be more confident and completely himself. Something I think Dustin encourages in Mike as well. He's a great ally. I honestly just wish Susie didn't exist, since she adds nothing but bad humor and time wasting while not impacting Dustin's development at all. This kid's a champ and he really doesn't need her. Sorry if you're a Susie fan. Dustin adds much needed comic relief, and he shuffles from the kid story thread to the teen story thread well, because although he's a goofy nerd, his intelligence and insight mature him, but he only matures after he makes that little lizard monster mistake. So his arc is subtle and straightforward, but it heightens him from being a Mushu-like comic sidekick to being a core emotional backbone of the group scenes. To that end, I think of him as a shapeshifter ally who pairs well with young adults like Steve and young kids like Erica.
Demogorgon is tired of your silly human bickering. It stops towards you. Boo!
Mike Wheeler. So, in the original notes for the show, Mike was actually going to be super quiet and shy, but Finn Wolfhard's audition tape completely changed the character's direction. And let me tell you, this kid is hilarious in Season 1. His, little rage fits, how chill he is about Elle's powers, and his bickering with Nancy really make him seem like a totally normal, cute kid who also has a lot of compassion and strength underneath the surface, which is perfect for a leading role. I like how he and 11, as I mentioned earlier, are sort of two sides of the same coin. She knows all about the Upside Down and Demogorgons, and she has psionic powers, but she knows nothing about friendship or waffles or recliner chairs or regular life at all, and Mike represents everything we know in our world, slowly discovering the extraordinary as Elle is discovering the ordinary, which for her is actually extraordinary. It's beautifully symmetrical and balanced, and their instant loyalty to each other is really touching. He's the threshold guardian and mentor to her hero, and she's the threshold guardian and mentor to his hero, and only together can they conquer the shadow. However, it quickly becomes a huge bummer to see how he treats his friends. He goes from jumping off a cliff to his likely death to protect Dustin, to choosing making out with Elle over hanging out with his friends over and over again, pushing Will to a breaking point, and just being a jerk in general. I actually prefer that, though, to him in Season 4, which is just entirely useless and devoid of character. I wish some of his traits from Season 1 grew, or stood out more when he's a teenager. He could be much more of a leader. And apparently Season 5 is going to bring back old dynamics and come full circle to the beginning, so I am holding out hope that we get some more old school Mike. I think there is a good chance we will, because in every season he has a major conflict with a key ally. Lucas in Seasons 1, 2, and 4, and Will and 11 in Season 3. But they always have to reconcile their differences and unite to defeat the threat. So I'm hoping we'll see him step it up and become a leader again.
Screw that.
Nancy Wheeler. Okay, if we were only talking about Season 1, I would have included Nancy as one of our heroes. She has a complete journey. From the ordinary world of school and trying to flirt with Steve, to a call to adventure when Barb goes missing, to crossing the first threshold when she goes through the tree. She faces tests, allies with Jonathan, enemies with the bullies, Tommy H. and such. She goes through an ordeal confronting the Demogorgon, and then has a full return by the end, with her celebrating Christmas with Steve and gifting Jonathan that new camera. But she also, like many heroes, has a hard time coming back to the regular world. She's deeply traumatized by her role in Barb's disappearance, Barb's death, and that continues to impact her character throughout the later seasons, including her breakup with Steve. In Season 2, she continues to get more interesting time with Jonathan as they record Owens and help shut down the lab through the press as well as get together. After that, though, she's kind of stagnant as a character. She's always going to do the right thing and help the right people. She's brave and determined. She's, presented as the smart one, and she is smart and often takes charge. But beyond that, honestly, there's not that much to her. I feel like they had a really strong idea for her in Season 1 and then just let her flatten out a bit. And look, there was an opportunity for growth in Season 3. When she fights with Jonathan, Jonathan's not exclusively in the right, but it is true that Nancy was careless about his job and his family's financial needs. They should have used that fight to add a layer of compassion and humility, let her be wrong for a change. I'm frustrated because her arc in Season 1 is so strong and she's so relatable yet heroic. And then she sort of gets the Joyce treatment in Season 4. She's always cool, she's always right. Although Nancy does have that compelling complexity of guilt over Barb, and I hope they do more with that. She's a weird one, she's a weird character, since she changes dramatically from Season 1 to Season 4, so it seems like she might be a fully round, fleshed out character. But it actually just sort of happens, and we don't get much time understanding why, so she rings more flat. I love Nancy, and I hope we get more Nancy development, and Nancy familial relationships in Season 5.
Being a freak is the best, right? I'm a freak.
Jonathan Byers. So, as the kids and teens age, they go through phases of repressing who they are. That's part of the incredibly compelling nostalgia effect when scenes cut between the young kids in earlier seasons playing around and dressing as Ghostbusters versus the teenagers and adults, often forced to act against their nature. So, while it wasn't much of an apology, I did kind of like his dialogue in Season 1 trying to justify spying and photography, where he says, "No one says what they're thinking, but he can catch them in their true moments." Nancy tells him he's full of it, he doesn't know her, and I like that she does that because he was in the wrong, but honestly he made some good points. At this point, she's not really herself when she's with Steve. I like that when Nancy hangs out with Jonathan, in contrast, she's just focused on what matters the most. With the extreme danger at hand, she has to be herself, and Jonathan acts as almost a mentor in accepting who you are. That sort of just drops from him. By Season 4, he's not a photographer anymore, in that he doesn't take photos, but he also doesn't contribute any personality. I wish they had made it more clear, they had reiterated that Jonathan somehow, as an artist, can see past the veneers people use to express themselves socially. The only scene we get beyond Season 1 is Jonathan seeing Will talk in the van in the review mirror. Will is talking to Mike about how much 11 loves and needs Mike, and Jonathan can definitely tell that Will really means himself. When Jonathan and Will talk about that, it's a really nice scene, but it's chalked up to brotherly intuition, and I think that's kind of a character downgrade for Jonathan. I wish they let him be someone who can see people for who they truly are, a bit of an Owl Eyes from Gatsby figure. I wish they let him continue to be an artist in his photography, contributing to the idea that art can save us in the same way music, also art, saves us. Part of Vecna's villain rage is over how people present themselves as one thing but are actually another, and it fuels Vecna's evil. So it could be lovely to have Jonathan see something similar, but have it fuel good and compassion. There's the other instance of the writers failing Jonathan, and it's in season 3, and I just mentioned it with regards to Nancy. But when they're working together at the newspaper, Jonathan doesn't want to pursue the exploding rat story because he's scared of getting fired, and he tells Nancy that multiple times. She does get him fired, and then they have a fight in the car, and he argues that Nancy should have dropped the whole thing like their horrible sexist bosses told her to, and Nancy is rightly offended by this. But Jonathan also argues that Nancy comes from money and has no idea how much pressure Jonathan is under to support his family, and how important this job was. In this scene, they both make good points, and it makes it a compelling argument. But the show is only sympathetic to Nancy, and she never apologizes for getting him fired or for being inconsiderate. This should be a really key beat for Jonathan. He should be able to convince someone else to see things from his point of view. He also doesn't contribute narratively that much. Beyond season 1, he's just sort of there, supporting Nancy, but at no point does she ever really need him after season 1. So I hope we get more Jonathan connecting again with his mom and more Jonathan and Will scenes, but I've kind of lost faith in the writer's ability to keep Jonathan interesting.
I promise I keep you shitheads safe, and that's exactly what I plan on doing. We're staying here on the bench, and we're waiting for the starting team to do their job. Does everybody understand?
Steve Harrington. Obviously, Steve is awesome. But narratively, there is a pretty significant disconnect between the Steve the writers want us to have and the Steve we actually do have. Based on how much shoving together of Steve and Nancy there is in season 4, and how often characters talk about how much Steve used to suck, his narrative is clearly meant to be as follows. Steve is a bad jerk jock guy who falls for the perfect girl but is too selfish and immature for her, so she dumps him, which is the most humbling thing that's ever happened to him. So he wakes up and becomes a better, trustworthy, kind person, but it's too late, the girl got away, and he'll forever pine for her and hope she one day returns his feelings. That's not a bad story at all, but it's not really what we have. What we have is more interesting, which is Steve is an idiot who can't understand anyone who wants anything other than what he wants. He decides he wants Nancy because although she's not cool, she's exactly the type of person he assumes he'll end up with. So he's pursuing an ideal rather than an actual person. He can be a jerk, but he knows right from wrong, and after he goes too far mocking Jonathan and gets beaten up, he knows he has to comprehensively apologize. But that's not a transformation of character, and it's not until he sees that Nancy isn't infatuated with him, and until he befriends nerdy little Dustin, that he realizes he's been leading his life all wrong. He still has trouble letting go of his high school persona until he's forced to work one summer and he falls for Robin, who brings out the best in him and with whom he's very compatible and very comfortable. The first narrative only works if you ignore pretty much all of season 3, which would be a shame. But the second narrative only works if you ignore season 4's Steve and Nancy 2.0. So I've had a hard time sketching out his arc. Since he was originally supposed to die in season 1, it seems like they've had to reverse engineer a broader arc for him, and there are a few more stumbling blocks narrative-wise. In season 2, the arrival of Billy is presented like the big challenge to King Steve's status. But because A, we never really see Steve run the school, and B, Steve already has seemingly rejected that whole status by the end of season 1, in season 2, Steve seems more like he's just annoyed at this annoying guy than truly threatened on an existential level. Steve and Billy's final fight at the end of the season is a clear manifestation of self or hero versus shadow, with Billy representing everything Steve shouldn't be. and here Shadow briefly wins, but the key thing about Steve is that he always gets back up and keeps fighting. In season 3, he tells Robin he had overlooked her in high school because she wasn't cool and because his friends would have made fun of him. But Nancy wasn't cool, and his friends made fun of him. So I don't know, these are little things, but I think it's clear they didn't have a concrete plan for what to do with Steve, and in season 4, it started to feel like with every scene he's in, the writers are like, okay, let's just make this guy as handsome as possible. He's gonna be shirtless. He's gonna be shirtless with a denim vest. He's gonna be covered in dirt and blood. He's perfect with kids. He's funny, sweet. He listens. He leads. He follows. He sacrifices himself. He's perfect. And what's more sympathetic than a courageous hero whose one true love is with someone else? Someone else who also happens to be a loser now. I realize it seems like I don't like this character, but he's truly one of my favorites. Although he's often comic relief, he gets moments like when he sees the lights flashing and decides he can't leave Nancy and Jonathan in season 1, when he drives Dustin to the snowball, when he cares for Max. All of these moments have great emotional weight, and without them, the story would be much less impactful. He's a crucial member of the group hero action, and I'm always going to be glad when he's on screen. He's also the only bad guy whose redemption is truly earned, physically when he runs back in the house to fight the Shadow Demogorgon, and emotionally as he genuinely apologizes for everything he's done in a proactive way. So, I love Steve. I think there's a lot that goes wrong with the structure of his character, but the personality of his character and the emotional effect of his character are always 10 out of 10.
As losers pretend to be above it all, we still just want to be popular. Accepted. Normal.
Okay, Robin. I don't know her last name. Robin is a classic trickster ally. Does she trick people? No, but her sarcasm and one-liners are reminiscent of classic goofy sidekicks in a good way. She is mostly used narratively to uplift others. For example, her best scene in season 3 when she comes out to Steve was phenomenal and deeply important to many people, but as far as story goes, it seems her role there is to springboard Steve's development more than anything else. But she actually contributes a lot of intelligence to the group, and I wish they would highlight that more. In season 3, she translates the Russian code and then solves its meaning all on her own. And in season 4, it's her speech, not Nancy's, that gets them to see Victor Creel. And she's also the one who realizes music can be an escape from Vecna's mindscape, which might be the singular most important discovery of the season. Her narrative function in general is to be a core member of the team, whether that team is just the duo of her and Steve, or all together with Nancy, Dustin, and Eddie. Robin, in her inability to have a filter or present herself as anything other than who she is, helps keep the people around her real. Sometimes the hero is a group of people who band together, and in what becomes the sort of teenage misfits crew, it's hard to imagine them all working without her. I think she gets to be a bit of a shapeshifter when they set her up as Steve's love interest, but she instead reveals she's gay, and she becomes the consummate ally to him. I really hope that they don't go the route of cartoonishly dumbing her down, and I do hope they continue to put her in dope outfits. In their screenwriting masterclass, the Duffer Brothers say you have to pick only a few characters to have a real arc, but that shouldn't stop you from having depth and complexity in your side characters. And Robin is the perfect example of that. She hasn't really changed or developed since we first met her, even though she's gone through many challenges. But we have gotten to know her better.
My name is Lady Applejack, and I'm a chaotic, good, half-elf rogue level 14, and I will sneak behind any monster you throw my way and stab them in the back with my poison-soaked kukri, and I'll smile as I watch them die, a slow, agonizing death. So,
Erica Sinclair. Erica is a really welcome addition to the group, acting as a trickster ally most of the time. She's funny when she makes little cameo appearances in the earlier seasons, and it was a really smart move to give her more time in season 3. However, the writing for this character is pretty heavy-handed, and in my opinion, it's pretty obviously geared towards generating GIFs and hashtags more than towards a compelling character. That's not a huge problem, and at times it's needed to humor, But for example, just the facts as a catchphrase in a show whose writing is far better than most sitcoms feels out of place. And you can hop on the show's social media to see them trying to make just the facts a thing. I strongly recommend the Black Cinephile's breakdown of Erica in Season 3, which I will link in the description. Season 4 is a marked improvement for her. She gets to develop from being a haha, you're a nerd little kid to being a nerd herself, and once again it's Dustin who brings this out in her. It's a lovely passing of the torch as she uses D&D materials from Will, and we also get to see Dustin in a leadership position. In a season where Lucas gets to shine a bit, it was also nice to see him and Erica finally get some one-on-one time, and I think we can all agree we want more of that. I say eliminate Susie and give all of that time to Erica instead. They're both eccentric, outspoken girls, but Erica actually matters to the group, and we have emotional buy-in with her. She also represents another generation, which is refreshing after the kids sort of grow up and become a little boring. It's nice to have another youthful energy.
Friends don't lie. Yeah, well, boyfriends lie. All the time.
Max Mayfield. Alright, when Max shows up in Season 2, I'm honestly all kinds of confused. I can't tell if she's supposed to be super quiet and just disinterested in the boys, cool and aloof, or really outgoing and eager to join their party and make friends, because she does both of those things, kind of back and forth. And although she adds drama to the group, since Mike isn't a huge fan, she's not remotely necessary for the actual plot of the season. However, she is really fun, and she prompts character development for Lucas and Dustin. She also lets those kids become threshold guardians of the Upside Down as they protect the secret of the supernatural, showing how they've progressed since Chapter 1. Once we get to Season 3, Max's character is way more engaging. She does a world of good for Eleven as an ally and a trickster when they bind together. It obviously, though, is Season 4 where she shines. I love how cool and confident they make her demeanor seem from the beginning, while indicating that she's suffering inside. Vecna says he holds a mirror up to people, so they have to confront their own darkness. And Max's serious guilt over Billy's death is a poignant one, especially as we realize she's depressed, and she's distanced herself emotionally from her friends. Her near death is crushing, particularly because we know she sometimes wishes she were dead, but then, as she's actually confronted with death, she's not ready. She's sobbing, she's scared, and Lucas is helpless. It's a horribly sad scene that goes way beyond the tone and stakes and emotional resonance of the previous seasons. In Season 4, Max really carries the emotional stakes, raises everything to a way higher point than it's been before, and she's definitely elevated from trickster ally to a hero in her own right.
Oh, this whole situation, Harrington, I don't know. It's giving me the heebie-jeebies.
Billy Hargrove. So, there was a lot of wasted potential with Billy, I think. He has a really cool character introduction that got me very excited for this season, and his need to control every interaction could be interesting, but even as a flat character, his relentless one-note rage fest gets pretty old pretty fast. He kind of stretches from being an antagonist to being a villain even before he's possessed, because it seems like his motive is just to be as horrible as possible in every scenario. He's completely static and overbearingly mean in every single scene until, suddenly, the last few seconds of his life. I'm a little sick of this trope where we have a villainous character, particularly an angry, violent man, and then we see a glimpse of his life that complicates the picture, and/or he does one heroic thing, so apparently he's redeemed. That's not redemption. Redemption has to involve development. The character needs to make some sort of active change. And he does say, "I'm sorry" to Max just as he dies, and I can't lie, it's an emotional scene to watch. But also, what? Where did that come from? It seems like the show has a problem with male characters doing good things suddenly. Like, while I do think Steve earns his redemption in Season 1, Steve's decision to apologize is also very sudden. So I think instead of saying "I'm sorry" as Billy dies, he should say something like, "It wasn't me," or "That wasn't me," which could obviously refer to how he was possessed in Season 3, but also open up the idea that he was somewhat possessed before then by trauma, by his dad, by fate, indicating that there was this other Billy out there the whole time that he never really got to be. Dying then would be much more fitting as an end to a tragically fated character. Apologizing made it seem like all we had to do this whole time was tell you stories about your mom and you would have stopped sucking so much. But the more important change I would make to build a more comprehensive narrative for Billy is this. So at the end of season 2, his abusive father slams him against the wall because Billy hasn't looked after Max, and Billy continues to say, "She's not my sister. I don't care where she is." Then his dad hits him and sends him out basically to find Max or not come home. It would have been way better if instead the abusive dad had been introduced way earlier, and then Billy at the end of season 2 could be the one to notice that Max was missing, and he would yell at their parents and gone on his own quest to find her. His rage could be driven by hurt that his mother left him. He could still beat up Steve and threaten the kids, he could even shout at Max cruelly, whatever, but we would get this idea, this glimpse that some part of him is motivated by being protective, even if he doesn't realize it. And we could see why, although every other character has no problem hating him, Max has some hint of an internal conflict over it. This would make a lot more narrative sense than what we do get, which is by and large Billy not caring about Max at all, but every once in a while caring about her way too much. Look, a lot of people are kind of obsessed with this character, but I think those people aren't Billy Hargrove fans, they're Dacre Montgomery fans. Which is warranted, since he is an incredible actor, obviously very attractive, but we shouldn't conflate the two, and I can only imagine how universally hated this character would be if he weren't absurdly hot. With a few minor tweaks, Billy could have been one of the best characters. His fixation on Steve is pretty fascinating, and I like how he pretty much ignores everyone else, showing that it's not about being popular, it's about dominating the one guy who represents a happier version of himself. Also, every scene with Billy and Mrs. Wheeler is awesome. His focused antagonism towards Lucas is either blatant racism or bad writing that appears as blatant racism, and neither one of those contribute anything towards the story or his character. In contrast, Billy is clearly and intentionally sexist in the way he discusses women, but that adds to his character and makes sense given his struggle with masculinity and male power at home. He's clearly the antagonist shadow to Steve, and certainly a shapeshifter in season 3. There is so much back and forth online about Billy, whether he's good, whether he's bad, whether he's redeemed, etc., etc. But I really think it's another instance of there being a big difference between the Billy we have and the Billy the writers really want us to have. Most of the arguments I see defending Billy, including those from Dacre Montgomery himself, which are really interesting and insightful and very artistic, all come from reading into things or adding ideas to the Billy that we have, imagining other scenarios, imagining what's going on in his head. And that's all very well and good, and it's a strong point of the show that we are invited in to create things of our own. But it's not self-evident. Self-evidently, Billy just is a very one-note character, and I think they could have done a lot more, as I've said, to build him a more compelling and comprehensive arc.
Welcome to Hellfire.
Eddie Munson. So, I'm afraid to say that this is another instance of the writers wanting us to see an Eddie that's actually different to the Eddie we really have. And that's due to the way they kill him off and the narrative they force on that. And I just gotta say, his death was really stupid. The bats only needed to be distracted momentarily, and he and Dustin accomplished that. Then he just dies for no reason. And they clearly want us to think, oh, wow, he's really completed his arc, he's come a long way, he was a coward, but now he's brave, wow. And I know they want us to think that because they have him tell us that over and over again, nearly verbatim. I run away. Hey, there's no shame in running. That's what I do now, I guess I run away. And then when he's dying, I didn't run this time, right? And I guess no, technically you didn't, but running was part of the plan, which you knew in advance, and then you just killed yourself to double down on a task you'd already accomplished. Really, you could argue that dying in the Upside Down is actually running. It's escaping the horrible social hatred and likely trial waiting for him in the regular world. And I don't mind what they did with Eddie, I don't mind that he died, but it's not even a sacrifice, so it doesn't feel heroic. It's just weird. And look, I have a feeling that if fans weren't so obsessed with Eddie, they'd probably just leave his death as is, but since he's got his own cult following now, they'll probably find a way to involve Eddie's memory in Season 5, like they did with Billy in Season 4, and they might reverse engineer some more meaning onto his death. But we'll see. And that would be fine. The Duffer Brothers actually put a lot of work and time into Eddie, and went back and added more once they worked with Joe Quinn for a while, so it's no accident that he's a really impactful character despite being a side character. When we first meet him, Eddie initially seems like you basically have to be in his specific club, or else you're a brainwashed conformist. He delivers this frankly obnoxious speech in the cafeteria that honestly I wasn't a huge fan of. But that speech gets beautifully subverted in the scene in the woods with Chrissy. At one point, he's telling her about the talent show they were in together during middle school, and he says something like, you were doing your cheerleader thing, you know, and he acts out pom-poms. I thought in that split second he was going to be making fun of her, but then he continues to say, it was pretty cool, actually. So now we've got a good character. I mean, he just stood up on a table, facing off with her boyfriend about how boring he is for playing basketball, and then he says her cheerleading thing was actually pretty cool. Eddie goes out of his way to make people around him who need it feel comfortable. So maybe his big speech in the cafeteria wasn't a self-obsessed vanity rant. Maybe it was a show of strength for his club. He says he brings in the sheep, the little freshmen who need someone to watch over them. And you know what? Probably in the school they're in suburban Indiana in the 80s, the nerdy kids need a fearless, kind of obnoxious leader. So he knows it, and he acts fearless for them. Chrissy in the woods is shaky and scared. We can tell he sees this, and then he makes himself goofy and approachable and funny for her. He knew that she would think he was mean and scary, and he undermines that himself by being so kind and fun that she actually gets this fleeting reprieve from Vecna's curse. So Eddie represents the outsider, and I think every person alive has a part of them that can relate to that. He stands for everything beside the norm, and they make sure we know that. And then fans, many of them insist that he's gay, some insist he's bi, or asexual, or straight, in love with Steve, in love with Chrissy, whatever. The best thing about him is that we'll never know for sure. And look, I'm not advocating for queer-coding characters without actually addressing their sexuality, but in this instance, I like that we're all pulled into the story of Eddie. We can all watch an episode and see the same character, but then go home and have a totally different character in our minds that's constructed partly within our imagination, and that's okay, that's good. It's the exact opposite of what J.K. Rowling does when people find plot holes in Harry Potter and then she addresses them on Twitter, adding to the world. It's instead giving us a slice of world that's tragic in ending and ubiquitously relatable throughout, with really strong characterization, personality, and personal effects, and then just letting it be. With Eddie, more is unsaid than is said, and it really works. Unlike Billy, Eddie is a flat character who has good depth to him. He was dynamic. He has different relationships with each character, whereas Billy is just mean to everyone no matter who they are. So narratively, Eddie's function is pretty obvious, but he also helps slow down the pacing in Season 4, when we have these big clusters of characters moving around really chaotically. They can then cut to Eddie on the run, where the tension is palpable, but it's slower and quieter. Eddie is a really key part of Season 4, and it would be really hard to imagine this season without him. If Eddie has to die, and they're gonna act like it was heroic, even though it is getting a little repetitive with 11, then Bob Newby, then Hopper and Billy, if you're gonna do it right. Have the death be absolutely essential, and have it really impact the other characters. And then instead of this running away nonsense, I would have used him thematically to bridge the fantasy world, like the fantasy world of D&D, with reality, and remind us that fiction and fictional worlds and stories matter and can inspire greatness within us, which they hinted at, but they could have done more with. I don't think he actually needs an arc at all, but if you want him to have one, it should not have required super awkward dialogue. Eddie is a great flat character and was the perfect addition to Season 4.
Each life, a faded, lesser copy of the one before. Wake up, eat, work, sleep, reproduce, and die.
Vecna, /1, /Henry Creel. Vecna is an effective mega-villain of the series because he takes the upside down to everyone else. The victims in his mindscapes, in their bodies, remain in their reality, but their mind is in the upside down, or the upside down is in their mind. This is a powerful overarching threat, And a frightening end of Season 4, not only because all the monsters and attacks they'll have to handle, but also because the Upside Down is a horrifying mirror of our own world. Vecna knows and is our lowest points and our darkest thoughts. He preys on sin or shame. He's the ultimate shadow villain, the perfect balance to our hero 11. If we look at the three major phases of his life, young Henry Creel, adult orderly who's secretly one, and finally Vecna, his progression from sort of weird kid to villain is perfectly logical, especially because God knows what Dr. Brenner did to him as one. That said, I do think there's some confusion around his motives as a villain. As a kid, he hated that his dad acted like a good person, but was secretly a war criminal, so he punishes his dad, sure, but geez, why kill your mom and sister too? And why, as Vecna, act like you're targeting people who are secretly bad? As far as I can tell, the only victim of his who did anything bad was that weird little journalist boy that seems to have committed like a mass homicide hit and run. They gave that kid such a heavy story, but Chrissy gets killed even though she's only ever the victim of abuse. It seems more plausible that Vecna hunts out vulnerabilities in our minds, and can only enter if we have any, sort of like the Dementors in Harry Potter. He also hates weak things, but that's just not enough of a motive for a core villain. He clearly wants revenge for what 11 did to him. He thinks people are inherently bad and weak, but restoring order via destroying Hawkins and killing people doesn't make a lot of sense and doesn't make for a very compelling motive. I assume in Season 5 we will understand him more. Maybe we'll understand why he didn't or couldn't kill his maker, Dr. Brenner. And I hope we get more of pre-Vecna 1, who was just dazzling as a shadow mentor and then trickster to young 11, and he gives a pretty sweet villain speech after the massacre. And I think we have to get more. We might even understand how he has his mindscape vision powers that Elle's sister sorta had too. Also, I think I'm in the minority here, but I can't take Vecna's voice seriously. Like, when he says names super slowly, it just sounds weird.
Remember what you did, Nancy.
I mean, come on.
I'm sorry, 11. This is not how I wanted things to begin.
Dr. Brenner. I think we still have a lot to learn about Dr. Brenner, like how and why did he breed magical kids? And how did he get the confidence to brand the first magical kid 1 with space for 2 more digits? Were you planning on hundreds, buddy? But I love the idea that he knows he made a monster in 1, but he can't bring himself to abandon or really condemn him. He also sort of feels a little bit like the Old Testament God, making beings and loving them, but punishing them as well. He is important because he unites Vecna and 11, not just mechanically in the plot, but also as their maker. Dr. Brenner's existence also saves Elle from thinking she's the monster, because she's able to recognize that Dr. Brenner really is the monster. So this is an important aspect of characterization for our hero, who we need to be good, and we need to have an internal conflict within our hero between good and bad, and now this Dr. Brenner sort of anchors the bad away from her. Dr. Brenner and Dr. Owens have very similar narrative function, but the difference between them dramatically speaking is stark. I actually think Dr. Owens is slightly more interesting, although slightly less important, because he is so nice and he treats the kids with solid respect, but he is part of a larger nefarious organization. Unless we find out more about Dr. Brenner really just sucks, and all this crap about Papa just makes him worse and creepy. He shows the dark side of the mentor archetype, one who abuses, gaslights, and controls their mentees. His gaslighting is so effective that when Elle slaughters everyone else around him, Dr. Brenner doesn't even show the slightest concern that she might harm him. It was a nice gesture to unlock the shock collar that he put on her as he dies, but there is no redemption for this guy, and I love that his dying wish is rejected. He's a father and a mentor role in the worst way.
Loaded coffin.
Garone.
Oh my god, yes,
You do
no,
remember,
of course,
right?
with a name like that, how could I forget?
I don't know.
Chrissy Cunningham. Chrissy is the last character I'm going to talk about, and it's because she is flawlessly written and exemplifies the craft of writing supporting characters. She is in 1 episode. She has no business being this compelling. The Stranger Things writers are incredibly efficient at getting us to know and care about Chrissy, and it's because they use familiar archetypes and mental association to save time. We see a happy, pretty cheerleader dating a star jock, and subconsciously we attach all sorts of preloaded associations. We see she's struggling with body image, and again, we know this character trope pretty well and may have emotional associations with that. The juxtaposition between her very first scene, smiling at Jason and seeming perfect, and then the very brief sighting of her coming out of the guidance counselor's office as Max walks by, is also an efficient way of building conflict and story. She seems super happy in public. In a brief private moment, she's sad in the hallway. And then later on, as she breaks down in the bathroom, she goes from being sad to being angry and panicked. And mind you, she has barely spoken a word at this point. Compare that very quick narrative to Max's introduction in season 2. Max is shy, then outgoing, then cool, then dorky, then shy, then outgoing, and I have no idea what to make of her. Chrissy, all it takes is 3 short vignettes and we have a story. But it's her scene in the woods with Eddie that is an absolute masterclass in storytelling. Even though we just met her, we can already tell she's acting way out of her character by doing this drug deal. And that's impressive enough already that we're able to spot uncharacteristic behavior in a character we just met. And then when she asks for even harder drugs, we know the stakes are even worse than we guessed. As I mentioned in Eddie's section, he creates a space for her to be comfortable, and we get the sense that this is the real Chrissy. But most importantly, this scene sets up a long story that never happens, because she dies. The writers use the familiar story tropes of star-crossed lovers and love triangles that are so familiar to us that our brain autofills an idea of drama for the entire season. They even drop in a line where Eddie suggests Chrissy come to his band on Tuesday night, and again our brains think, okay, she's gonna lie to Jason and see Eddie, or she won't show up and Eddie will be sad, or they're gonna hook up, or any formulation of the many forbidden high school romances we've seen dozens of times. When that gets cut off very suddenly when she dies, we feel robbed, we feel wronged, and we already have an emotional connection to this character because we've seen her live with the tension of her outside persona and her inner pain. And we're already excited for the drama, maybe romance of the season, and then suddenly it's gone. Now, why is this so important? Why did they make Chrissy? Well, Chrissy's job is to launch the threats of the season. She's a supporting character, and she supports the villains. She creates Vecna for us. He's still a bit of a mystery, but we know to be terrified way before the regular characters do. She also launches the human threat of Jason. So with Chrissy here, we have a background character who has a simple function of dying. But by using familiar archetypes and the emotions of internal conflict, she tells an entire movie's worth of story in only a few minutes. This is Stranger Things writing at its best. They regularly use expository conflicts to build characters in efficient ways. For example, going back to season 1, Steve wants Nancy to skip class and make out. Nancy refuses. We have a decent idea of each of them. Dustin wants Will to roll protection. Lucas wants a fireball. Benny, the burger guy, whose name I remember now, wants Eleven to help, and she refuses. Hopper brushes his teeth with liquor, but he's also the chief of police. Chrissy is happy cheerleader, but suffering tremendously inside. Go ahead and compare Stranger Things with most other shows these days, and you'll see how efficient and compelling the character building is. Honestly, each character deserves their own few hours looking at costumes, music, hair, demeanor, all choices that are very intentional and impactful. So there are plenty of other characters that deserve time. Jason, Mrs. Wheeler, Bob Newby, Dimitri, Tommy H., Barbara, Mr. Clark, Alexi, more. We could be here all day, and we sort of were. But I wanted to spend a lot of time on characterization in Stranger Things because it's the strongest thing about the show. And it's what keeps people coming back after all these years. It's what keeps people engaged in the 2-year interims between seasons. Next, we'll look at the structure of each season and some of the key storytelling elements like setting and pacing. So season 1 actually isn't called season 1, although I'll be calling it that. It's called Stranger Things, and the seasons after it are Stranger Things 2, 3, 4, because the Duffer Brothers really wanted to package the story like a horror adventure movie or novel from the 80s. Back in the day, Books by authors like Charles Dickens would be released on a serial basis, a chapter-by-chapter basis, and I think they were trying to replicate that here, although more inspired by the 80s and Stephen King than by Dickens. Stranger Things starts with the episode Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers. Even the titles of the episodes feel smart and deliberate. If all you knew about the show is the chapter title, The Vanishing of Will Byers, you can already feel some of the tension and mystery that carries the whole season. It already asks a question. Will's disappearance kicks off 3 strands of story, each of which are absolutely essential and each of which come together in the end. This was part of the Netflix pitch, and the Duffer Brothers thought of each generational story strand as a different 80s universe. The adults are in a Spielberg film, the teens are in a horror film like Nightmare on Elm Street, and the kids are in a Stephen King novel. In the following seasons, this delineation blurs slightly, and in season 4, the adult story strand is entirely removed from everything else, its own action movie. But in season 1, the story and structure is pristine. As the season unfolds, each distinct group achieves distinct accomplishments, and crucially, discovers key pieces of information that the other groups do not have. The kids discover Elle, and as she discovers their world, they discover hers. Nancy's call to adventure, one step behind her brothers, is when Barb goes missing. She then gives up her boyfriend and social status to team up with new ally Jonathan. Hopper examines the same mystery the younger characters are discovering, but at a different level, the top level, and he then teams up with Joyce. In order to defeat the evil of the season, they all absolutely have to come together, share resources and knowledge, and team up against the bad guys. The soundtrack features John Carpenter synth tracks played over what would otherwise be sitcom-like suburban scenes, building up the story world, signaling the genre, and setting the mood. Music director Nora Felder considered Should I Stay or Should I Go a character in and of itself, showing that when they did include old classics, the songs are used intentionally to evoke not only familiarity but also character and connection. Other 80s references like E.T., The Goonies, as well as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings novels, Indiana Jones, add to the story but take a rightful back seat to the characters in their own story. I think of the 80s setting in Stranger Things as a narrative framing device, so that we're already in a story world, the 80s as the Duffer Brothers see it, when we discover the new world, the upside-down sci-fi one. Allusions to other stories is also an efficient way to connect the audience to the story. I see 11 flip a van over. I remember watching E.T. with my dad when I was little, and even if I'm not aware of it, I've made an emotional connection to Stranger Things. Is that a cheap marketing technique? No, not as long as you can watch having never seen or heard of E.T. and still enjoy Stranger Things. Allusions can enrich the story world, but they should never create it alone, and they don't here. Pop culture references also save time in world building. The kids regularly refer to Star Wars, D&D, X-Men, and we get a general idea of what type of powers Elle might have. World building requires a great deal of exposition, and Season 1 accomplishes this through strategic flashbacks that show what Eleven can and can't do, a science teacher who can explain things like the concept of a parallel universe, so we know what we're dealing with, without seeming too convenient, since he's entirely in the dark about what's actually going on. And by spreading out the core discoveries so we, the audience, can piece things together ourselves. Pixar screenwriter Andrew Stanton once said, "Good storytelling never gives you 4, it gives you 2 + 2. And that's exactly what Season 1 does. And it's not Westworld, it's not super complicated, but it's just enough that we can piece things together, feel invested in the plot and engaged with the story, while also relaxing and just enjoying things unfolding in front of us. The setting choices in Season 1 are very intentional and noteworthy as well. In Season 1, we have Mike's basement, representing the ordinary world for most of the characters and for the audience. The house is the ultimate man-made space for intimacy and family, especially a basement. In The Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard describes the house as, quote, "always in our daydreams. The house is a large cradle. Life begins well, it begins enclosed, protected, all warm in the bosom of the house." This is the safe place for our characters. It's where the kids play and enjoy imagination, where they strategize and prep for finding Will. It becomes Eleven's safe haven from all the bad men trying to find her. Will's house, in contrast, becomes a sort of gate, a conduit between our world and the Upside Down, both literally as the Demogorgon bursts through its walls and metaphorically as Joyce tears the place apart, literally dismantling all the normalcy of a home to connect instead with the supernatural. Another key setting is the woods. Interestingly, the series was actually developed under the title Montauk, where the camp hero conspiracy theories served as the backdrop to the plot and as a driving inspiration for the Duffer Brothers. The beach would have instead played a focal role, with Hopper living in a little beach cabin and Will disappearing along the shore. The forest, though, works way better, and I'm really glad they had to settle for Hawkins instead. The forest is a common fixture in storytelling and fairy tales. We see it in The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, many Shakespeare plays, The Wizard of Oz, and so on, as a space where social customs are abandoned, and imagination and wonder come to light, as do nightmares. Heroes venture into the woods to face the darker sides of themselves, the unknown, the dangerous, and it can be a real test of strength and friendship. When the kids find 11 in the woods convey meaning to the audience in a way that wouldn't work if they found her, say, on a random street corner or at school or whatever. They immediately know there's something unusual about this girl, not just because she has a shaved head and is wandering around alone, but because she emerges from the dark mystery of the forest. The forest is also where Nancy and Jonathan are able to become friends, free from the social pressures that they encounter in regular life. The lab, the school, and the quarry are all sites of growth this season as well, but the main guy, the biggie, the obvious setting is the Upside Down. In Stranger Things, our general story world is a standard suburb in 80s rural America, secretly adjacent to a mirrored reality called the Upside Down. And I'll talk about what the Upside Down represents and what it implies later on, but the key thing to note here is that it's a huge expansion of the world for our characters, and a place where we don't know the rules, we have no familiarity. Season 1 is the best storytelling package by far. It's neat, balanced, well-paced. There's a wide cast of characters, but they all matter and feel real. And while they open a window for the second season, the story does go there and back again in a resolved, satisfying way. I give Season 1 a 10 out of 10 for storytelling. The various branches of the plot in Season 2 aren't quite as neatly delineated, essential, and efficient as in Season 1, but they're still very entertaining, and we all fall in love with new dynamics like the way Steve protects the little kids and inspires Max to stand up for herself. But as much as I love Max, you could really take Billy and Max out of this season and nothing would change, which is a stark contrast to Season 1 where all of the characters, main ones and supporting characters, are really essential. Nonetheless, it is nice to have some human conflict with Billy while this heavy sci-fi action is happening. The pacing, however, is a big problem. In Season 1, we also had some human conflict in the school bullies. We meet them early on, and then we see the stakes raised during the school assembly, and finally we have a climax to their conflict at the quarry in a pivotal scene demonstrating triumphant loyalty amongst Mike, Dustin, and 11. This happens in episode 6 of 8, and then we never see them again. Good. Compare this to Season 2. We meet Billy in episode 1. We see him pretty consistently throughout the season, but the tension remains pretty much the same. It's dialed up to the same threat all throughout. And then it's not until episode 9, the final episode of the season, that we get a climax to this human conflict. At this point, though, the supernatural conflict is already at a boiling point. We've already seen Bob Newby eaten to shreds by monster dogs, so having this human bully show up is more annoying than anything else. The bullies in Season 1 serve as a test of friendship. They challenge the group, advance the plot and character bonds. Billy, the bully replacement in Season 2, doesn't actually serve any narrative purpose and feels pretty redundant. Overall, in terms of structure, besides some new character pairings, it's mostly the same. Hopper goes on a mission, sort of linked up with Joyce. The kids have their own issue, linked up with Steve. And Nancy and Jonathan do their own investigation. It's the same build as Season 1, but it doesn't feel repetitive because of the new character dynamics and a more mysterious villain. There's a huge conflict in the hospital with the Demodogs, but that is really teeing up for the bigger issue of closing the gate, which reminds me a bit of Return of the King, where the grand battle scenes are actually a setup for Frodo and Sam destroying the ring. The only new setting of note is the arcade, which works as a nostalgia piece and as another dimension of imaginary conflict along the lines of D&D. It also helps establish the new world of Season 2 as we open up with the kids going to the arcade and we get a sense of how things have changed since the end of Season 1. Little details like having Will's mom drop him off in a car instead of letting him cycle there on his own show that some things have changed, while all the boys getting together and hanging out in the same tone as they were in Season 1 shows that some things have remained the same. Season 2 escalates the threat of the unknown by having a more insidious effect on our characters, namely Will, and it ends on this bright, happy note with the snowball, and then twists it to a sickening final shot hitting at peril to come, which wraps everything up nicely for our season, but opens the door for Season 3. It's a great season with a few minor flaws, and I land it at a 9 out of 10 for storytelling. Season 3 is definitely the most polarizing season, with some people absolutely hating it and worrying the show was ruined forever, and others really adoring it. I loved it on my first watch. I thought it was a lot of fun, but I barely got through my rewatch. This season leans very heavily on aesthetic, which, to be fair, is fantastic, but doesn't make for great rewatching or exploring of the world. It was very smart to use summer break as a way to switch things up and also not have to deal with school. This brings all of our characters into a new realm of summer that's familiar to us because we all know what summer break is and we can imagine what Hawkins would be like. The mall was actually a location tossed around in the writer's room for Season 1, and it was a good idea to put it on hold as a tactical choice for the epicenter of a few different storylines in Season 3. The mall allows for multiple storylines to overlap, even without the characters noticing, and it's also an easy way to incorporate more 80s references. But really, I think if you took Robin and Steve out of their Scoops Ahoy outfits and didn't have a cool Madonna soundtrack over the shopping spree, the season would genuinely suffer, which is pretty telling. They're really selling us a vibe here, and it doesn't take the backseat to the story like it did in previous seasons. It's very front and central. The Body Snatchers plot also, it sucks. I'll just say it. It sucks. It's fine when it was just Billy and the kids need to confront him, we have some human tension, and it's limited to one person. But the whole Nancy Jonathan stuff at the newspaper with the exploding gooey rats and evil sexist zombie creeps that chase them around the hospital while Billy makes an army of the undead, it's just too stupid. While Season 2 built upon the story world, none of the expanded threats were implausible in comparison to Season 1. We've seen Demogorgons, so Demodogs seem natural, and then the Mind Flayer was slowly built as a concept that we knew was only temporarily handled at the end of the season. The problem with Season 3 is that it stretches the rules of the story world that we've come to know. Obviously, in sci-fi, pretty much anything can happen, but as viewers, we still need to be able to plausibly guess what's going on or what will happen next. Not only does this season mutate the Mind Flayer from the terrifying, shadowy spider being from Season 2 into this disgusting, gooey glob, but also the season stretches which sort of field of sci-fi we're in. As I mentioned earlier, one way they've built the story world is by situating the unfamiliar through references to the familiar, like Star Wars and X-Men. But the gooey rats thing and Army of the Living Dead break the confines of the previous two seasons in a way that feels like a whole new genre and sticks out from the rest of the show. Structurally, I have a big issue with this season. In previous seasons, I think Nancy and Jonathan would have pursued this rat thing together, and they would have found out some vital piece of information that the other characters were missing. Then everyone would have to come together by the climax like they do in seasons 1 and 2. But no. The kids solve everything on their own. Elle and Max realize that not only is Billy possessed, but also he's recruiting other people, and they know the Mind Flayer is behind everything. By the time Nancy comes down into the basement and says, hey, I need to talk to you guys, she's got nothing to say that the kids already don't know. So really, the kids tell her what's going on, and she's like, oh, yeah, okay, that explains the rats, I guess. This is hugely disappointing. While Hopper and Joyce do discover the vital information that the Russians are opening the gate, Steve's squad has already seen that, and Hopper's business with the mayor feels more like an extraneous subplot than genuinely connected to the rest of the story. So while again we have everything delineated amongst 3 different storylines, they're not all vital, they don't line up, and there's no sense of payoff as they all come together at the end, since they don't really do that in a way that makes sense. This season also had some weird attempts at booyah, feminism, and political messaging. They don't really affect the story, but I wanted to mention it and recommend Thought Slime's video unpacking the liberal ideology in this season, which I'll link in the description. It's a messy season structure-wise, and while some characters become awesome, like Steve and Will, others like Hopper and Mike took a real hit. I give this season a 6.5 out of 10 for storytelling. Season 4. Jeez, I have so much to say about this season. Maybe even too much. I wouldn't want to, bite off more than I can chew and expand what I'm trying to accomplish so much that I neglect basic fundamentals and undermine my own purpose. Do you see where I'm going with this? No, I really loved Season 4. The suspense and general stakes are way cranked up, and since it's the penultimate chapter in the entire story, it makes sense that all of our characters start at low points internally. Even though evil was largely defeated last season, the sheer inescapability and opaque threat of Vecna makes it feel like the Empire has struck back, Voldemort is on the rise, Sauron is building his army. But from a storytelling structure perspective, Season 4 has both the highest highs and the lowest lows. And I actually do have a lot to say, because it was really 3 television shows shoved into one. Remember back in Season 1, how the Duffer Brothers wanted 3 separate 80s fiction homages, with the little kids and Stephen King, the teens and classic horror, and the adult Spielberg film? That division only worked because they all revolved around the same inciting incident, Will and Barb's disappearance. And they each came together at the end with a unique set of skills and information. So while yes, there are 3 strands to it, there really is only one major plot. In Season 4, these are the major storylines. 1. Vecna's curse in Hawkins. 2. The Russia action movie with Hopper and Joyce. 3. Mike and the Byers out in California, which later gets divided into 11 and Project Nina, and Mike, the Byers, and Argyle's road trip. Those are all kicked off by 3 different inciting incidents. They all have to answer different questions and go through different challenges, and they really don't impact each other. So I'm going to look at them one at a time, starting with the Russia action movie. So what has to happen out in Russia? What's the big problem? They have to get Hopper back. That's it. All the other side issues, all the roadblocks and obstacles are only worthwhile, they're only worth our time as the audience if they convey key themes or crucial character development. So while the Russia plot is certainly an entertaining spectacle, it's beautiful to watch, it's hard not to be a little frustrated with how overall useless most of our time here is. Hopper, as our hero, does go through key development and poignant introspection, but he's gone from relatable outlaw hero to Marvel-esque action figure who's indestructible. So while he does get complicated and I really enjoy those scenes, fundamentals of him have changed so much that it's hard to relate him back to the Hopper we originally met. Joyce and Murray, it's the first time in the show I feel like they've put together a bad pair. They don't really function well with each other. They're not 2 sides of the same coin. They don't need each other like good pairs should. Contrast them to Steve and Dustin. Dustin needs Steve. He needs this action person. He needs this confidence. He needs bravery and physical strength. Steve needs Dustin. He needs this sort of thoughtfulness, the intelligence, and together they work really well. But Joyce and Murray, not so much. Murray is now this indestructible fighter, and he's also the brains behind most of their strategy, leaving Joyce with not all that much to contribute. Most of her time this season is spent yelling at Murray or various Russian guards. It's fine that she's stagnant as a character, but it doesn't make much logical sense for her to be utterly fearless and relentlessly bold. I got a little tired of watching her yell at people who have entire control over her, and it doesn't feel at all like the Joyce we know and love. But the major problem with Russia is the amount of time wasting. Yuri is probably the worst character this show has ever produced. He's a blatant plot device to slow things down, that's all. And then when the plot is ready for them to fly home, it only takes about a minute to convince him to help. So for a long stretch of the Russia story, the big problem, the big hurdle and obstacle is just this guy who won't help them out. There are a series of repetitive heists. We have to break in, we have to break out, we have to break in then out again. There's a gladiator plot. There's a lot that goes on, but it's a key example of writing in big plot moves that don't need to happen. They're just filler. When you're writing a script or book or whatever, if you decide you want some big epic action that comes out of nowhere, that's fine. But you should situate it within the core themes of the show, or have it be a multifaceted challenge for your character's inner development. Here, everything just keeps happening and happening and happening, and it doesn't really go anywhere. If they really want a branch of story out in Russia, which to be clear, I really don't, but fine. I would change the season 3 finale so that Hopper's sacrifice doesn't appear to be death, but rather is visually allowing himself to be taken captive by the Soviet government. Joyce then should be racked with guilt over sentencing him to that fate, and she should struggle with the conflicting responsibilities of flying all the way over there to rescue him and staying home to protect her very vulnerable children. There should also be a plot-based reason why they need Hopper back. I'm not saying I don't care about it otherwise, I love Hopper, but there should be some pressure, some tension, some man, we need Hopper for this. It could be as simple as Eleven needing him back as her mentor/father figure in order for her to have faith in herself and regain her powers. Anything like that would have made a big improvement. And it may be that everything we saw in Russia will be crucial next season, but in season 4, this giant subplot that takes up a lot of our time has absolutely no bearing on our core story. And that's the key rule of subplots. If you're gonna have one, it needs to matter to the core story in some way. It can even just have thematic relevance. But all these little side heists and the whole trip in general could be removed from the whole season and nothing would change in the core plot. They do make a vague attempt towards relevancy with the hive mind, similarly to season 2, but because that A, doesn't appear to have actually impacted anything, and B, is introduced offhandedly as a last minute, oh yeah, there's no real drama or tension to that decision, and it just doesn't really work. California is not much better. What has to happen out here is just one thing. Elle needs her powers back, and she needs to get them back in time to get to Hawkins and fight Vecna. That's great, that's a great setup. We again have a scenario where the hero has to decide whether to complete their training or go help their friends. They were just shy of making Elle's arc this season really compelling. As I said earlier, I was pretty excited to see her come into her own confidence without her powers, and they spent so much time with the human antagonist of Angela that I was very confident Elle would learn how to cope with adversity without just blasting people around. This would be key development for our hero as she learns not just how to use her powers, but when to use them too, as well as the importance of mercy. But it seems like they leaned too much into making it a Carrie tribute and not enough into advancing Elle's development. So instead of all that, she just assaults Angela with a roller skate and upsets Mike. I guess for Mike, it's fine for her to make dozens of people's brains explode when it's with special powers, but now that it's by hand, it's just not cute. We also see in her memories that she was bullied in almost the exact same way back at the lab, but that appears to be relevant aesthetically only. In season 1, Elle was scared she was the monster because it was her who opened the gate initially, but by the end of season 1, she's made enough friends and earned enough trust that that issue is pretty much resolved. Then a few seasons later, she hits Angela at the roller rink and that conflict seems to open up again. And it becomes very important to her to realize that it was Dr. Brenner who was the bad guy all along, not her and not even really Vecna. It's great to have a hero who has both good and evil in them and has to actively decide to do good. That's a great story. It makes for great tension, and it conveys the key theme of friendship. But her internal struggle never has any bearing on the actual plot. She wasn't remotely tempted by Vecna's offer for the two of them to work together, and she's really never indecisive when it comes to doing the right thing. So all of that time spent on the, God, what if I'm a monster, I just assaulted a girl, introduction to the season, doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe they could have had Vecna weaken her by preying on that insecurity in particular, and then Mike's speech could have been about how good and trustworthy she is. Still, though, the Vecna reveal was one of the best scenes, not just in the show, but in recent television in general. It is the textbook example of the predictable surprise, which is a very delicate balance between genuinely surprising people, but in a way that we could have foreseen. You don't want everyone to guess it, but it needs to have been possible to guess it. The pacing up until that point in Elle's storyline was a little bit slow, but I do imagine everything we learned about the Hawkins lab will matter a lot next season, and the payoff was immense. But sadly, that brings me to the rest of the California kids, and it is pretty dismal. Mike, Will, and Jonathan should have been a pretty cool trio, but they have nothing to do. Nothing at all, and all three of them are pretty watered down as characters at this point. I think this is an unpopular opinion, but Argyle was a bad addition. It's fine to add a character whose sole purpose is comic relief, no problem, but he gets in the way of scenes that could have strong emotional resonance, and he hits the same humor over and over again. All that time in this thread spent on Susie's family and Argyle's marijuana humor should have just gone to characters that we actually care about. This is an instance where flattening out previously round characters left a lot of viewers feeling like we were cheated. And I really get the sense that the writing team was like, okay, let's send these guys on an old school road trip movie. What could happen there? What could we sprinkle in here and there? There could be a break-in, there could be a quirky Mormon family, side heist after side heist that adds up to a whole lot of nothing. But Hawkins. Hawkins is so much fun this season. We've already talked about how efficiently Chrissy raises the stakes and shows us how Vecna operates. So when Max is hit with the curse, we have this amazing 24-hour stress window where the tension and character dynamics are at their absolute strongest. Music is once again used not just to enrich the world, but also to convey story, to convey meaning, not to mention being a cornerstone of the actual plot. The timing of the human antagonist works better in this season than with Billy in season 2. Jason is established right away. We get a sense of who he is and what motivates him, and then the threat steadily escalates, including when Jason gets the whole town involved, so now our human antagonist is multiplied. And when Jason shows up during the epic climax, it feels like the serious problem it is rather than a nuisance. I did wish that they could have Lucas make more of an effort to convince Jason earlier on in the season that Eddie was innocent. That way we could get more of a glimpse into what made Lucas change his mind and return to the main squad. This would also have reinforced that it wasn't just a simple case of miscommunication, it was always going to happen this way. And that's our main contrast between Hawkins and the rest of the season. For the most part, the way Hawkins unfolds feels like a natural set of dominoes falling, whereas the other two strands are much more meandering and entirely unpredictable. Vecna's curse is a way better follow-up to the possession plot from season 2. He's really scary. Even the way they have him break bones is so gruesome and unfamiliar that we feel there is no way to avoid or protect ourselves against him. You cannot run away, you cannot hide from this villain, and it's an expansion of the story world in a big way, but it follows the same principles of the story world that were built in seasons 1 and 2, and then sort of neglected in season 3. We, the audience, are actually rewarded for knowing those rules. Electricity matters again, magnets matter again, gates matter again, the actual concept of the upside down matters again. And the exposition in this season is not exactly subtle. Since the world is expanding a bit, we need to learn new things, and pretty much every time they just have Steve or Robin act confused, so Dustin can just about break the fourth wall explaining everything. But they're absolutely able to get away with that because of the amazing charisma in this group of characters. Robin is somewhat dumbed down in a way I don't appreciate, but I still love her, and Steve, Dustin, Max, Nancy, Eddie, Erica, and Lucas are all at their best in terms of drama, humor, and charm, and charisma. Charisma lets them get away with a few minor things that don't make a ton of sense in Hawkins. Why did they think they could pull a trick heist on someone who can read minds and see everything? Why did they assume bats were the only threshold guardians of Vecna's lair? Why is everyone rooting for Nancy and Steve all of a sudden? But these are pretty much fine, and you don't even really notice them while you're watching. However, there is one plot issue in Hawkins that I simply can't look past. During the big Vecna reveal during 11's memories, Vecna at the exact same time just randomly decides to grab Nancy and freaking tell her. It is so insultingly beneath the show's standards of writing that I've spent a lot of time trying to justify it, but there is no acceptable explanation. I get why he chose Nancy. Nancy has guilt over Barb, so he can exploit that, but it doesn't explain why he would decide to tell her his life story. Hey there, Prime Adversary. I see you're trying to figure out who I am so you can destroy me. Man, you are so close. Let me just show you so you can understand my one vulnerability. The only way that could make sense is if Vecna were laying an elaborate trap for all of them. But he only needs to kill one more person for his big plan, and there was absolutely no reason why he didn't just kill Nancy in that moment instead of waiting for Max to take her headphones off. As I've said, I really do love the Hawkins plot this season. And on top of that, as I've said, I really enjoyed the big Vecna reveal scene, but in that scene, watching Nancy just follow him around is so frustrating. Nancy's function this season is to be the investigator, the detective, the discoverer, but that doesn't work as a character archetype if the villain just handily explains it to her. I get it, it's a hard problem to solve that 11 knows this information but doesn't exactly need it, and Nancy doesn't know this information but definitely needs it. But there were plenty of other creative ways around this, and the whole thing could have been avoided if they didn't spread our characters out so much. Because our characters are spread out, most of them don't make it back in time to have any sort of effect on the plot. But I don't mind that, because I think this season is really a setup for the finale season, and it's fine to assemble the squad just in time for the real epic confrontation, the last season. However, there simply wasn't enough work to connect the three pods of characters. They didn't even know what each other were doing. No one knew that Joyce was in Russia, and no one knew that Elle was getting her powers back, and none of anyone else knew that there was a Vecna problem happening in Hawkins. Honestly, if Hopper, Joyce, and Murray had all died halfway through the season, nothing would have been any different. That's not great. Again though, this season, Hopper and 11 have prominent roles that follow the phases of the hero's journey, and in Hawkins, the squad of characters altogether also follow the hero's journey, down to the collection of weapons, to various thresholds, a final confrontation, and a tragic journey home. Max is sort of the standout protagonist, but they really all need each other as a group to make this happen. There are some new settings this season, like a pizza shop, an asylum, a Soviet prison, and I will say I did enjoy how the tiny snowflakes in the Soviet Russia air closely resembled the particles floating around in the Upside Down, but otherwise this huge jump across the world disrupted the tidiness of the previous season story worlds without using the new settings to heighten plot or convey theme. Back in Hawkins, the Creel house served as an eerie inversion of the regular kids' homes. The idea of a terrifying house is a common storytelling trope, representing the power of the past over the present, a manifestation of our hero's greatest fears. It's seen in classics like Poltergeist, Carrie, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Shining, and more, and it was a great choice. The woods are used again here as a means of stripping away confining social structures. We first meet Eddie and Chrissy in the school cafeteria and gymnasium, respectively, where each of their social archetypes and identities dictate their persona, but then we get to the woods, and all of that gets stripped away so they can form a genuine human connection that would have never been possible if they talked at school. The same is true for Eddie meeting a bunch of other characters like Steve and Robin. Putting a bunch of our favorite characters in a van in California and sending them through the Southwest desert should have been far more interesting than it was. The road is a common storytelling platform, as is the desert, a place where characters are tested to their limits, and this works very powerfully for Will, in one moment, but other characters are entirely neglected. Actually, that the two useless subplots take place in desolate ice and desert, while the actual plot happens throughout a whole town and in the forest, is a pretty apt metaphor for this season's bizarre structure. I really think they should have spent less time on haha Argyle's high again and haha Susie's family's so weird, to instead invest more development in Mike, Will, and Jonathan, or anyone else that we already know. Compare how efficiently we connected with Chrissy and how neat her narrative was, to how much time we spent with Argyle and came away with nothing but mild entertainment. But despite all of these complaints and how frustrating I do find it, I loved season 4. I can't help it. It's so satisfying to have a villain who comes from a familiar place and has operated as puppet master behind all of our conflicts so far. It's so fun to watch my favorite characters break off into little pairs and solve little problems. The visuals are incredible. Music once again used with strategic intention for both plot and theme. Storytelling-wise, season 4 flexes big time with textbook perfection at points. Chrissy Cunningham altogether, Max's arc of realizing that despite her trauma, life is worth living, the cultural backdrop of the town actually mattering. But it also has a lot of fractures that namely come down to a needlessly overambitious structure and kind of lazy plot shortcuts. But all things considered, this season had one job, and it absolutely was accomplished, which was to get us excited for season 5. I can't really rank this one for storytelling because it was such a weird mix of 10 out of 10 moments and 2 out of 10 moments. So, no score. Hashtag Susie sucks. So now I'll take a look at some of the key themes and motifs that exist throughout all 4 series, with themes representing underlying or overarching meaning to the story and motifs being more literal objects that recur and relay themes. So starting off with time as a theme, represented often by clocks as a motif. Obviously in season 4, time is a huge theme in the way that Vecna kills, the way he frightens people, the way he conveys the inevitability of his curse, and the balance of 4 murders as a quarter hours ripping through the wall to the upside down. It's prevalent in other seasons too though, and seems to be a major underlying theme of the whole show. The first shot we get in season 1, episode 1 of regular Hawkins is a sprinkler at nightfall in the suburbs. And the sprinkler is actually ticking itself. It's just a sprinkler, it's really boring and mundane, but there's something foreboding and menacing about it, weirdly. And then it's immediately juxtaposed with a group of kids in Mike Wheeler's basement, playing Dungeons and Dragons, laughing and goofing around, but Mike, as Dungeon Master, is telling us, something menacing is approaching. It could just be a little throwaway foreshadowing for the Demogorgon, but because season 1 is so neatly delineated into kids, teenagers, and adults, I'd argue what's approaching as a theme is time itself. The kids evoke a heavy sense of nostalgia for simpler times when you make promises over spit handshakes and drop everything to help your friend at a moment's notice or jump off a cliff to protect them from bullies. Contrast them to Nancy. She sends Barb home so she can hook up with Steve, and you know what? Everyone makes decisions like that as we get older. As Nancy beats back against the Demogorgon and tries to find Barb, she's reclaiming her goodness, but her innocence from childhood is sort of lost forever. Also, as I already mentioned, Billy's final fight with Steve in season 2 is clearly a self versus shadow metaphor. And then, in season 3, it's repeated with Billy's final fight with the Mind Flayer, except this time, it's Billy confronting his shadow. In both cases, the shadow wins the fight, only to then be defeated by kids. To me, this reinforces the purity of childhood, and we should also note that they were able to banish the Mind Flayer from Will's mind in season 2, but as he grows up, his life complicates. His friends abandon him, and he carries the immense weight of secret love for Will. So I wonder if, no longer a kid anymore, he'll be more vulnerable to Vecna in season 5. Clocks, timing, times, all pop up recurringly, whether it's the Soviet riddle in season 3 or Hopper missing dinner time in season 2. I actually also think bicycles represent time, in part because they're a relic of childhood, but also in their endless repetitive spinning, something Vecna has major beef with. Evil. In stories, the shadow self is often the villain that corresponds to our hero, like Batman and the Joker, Harry Potter and Voldemort. In The Lord of the Rings, there's Smeagol and Gollum within one being, and there's also Gollum as Frodo's shadow. There's Saruman and Gandalf. Macbeth struggles with a shadow within himself as well as with Lady Macbeth. The list of examples goes on and on, from Star Wars to the Wizard of Earthsea, from Eminem's Slim Shady to the Divine Comedy in the Bible. It's a recurring theme in storytelling because it makes for a very compelling story. Frodo doesn't just take the ring to Mordor literally, encountering physical difficulties, he also fights with a version of himself along the way. These pairs share core similarities and even life stories oftentimes, but they choose distinct paths, and for the hero to win, he must confront his darker self. So this is obviously relevant to Stranger Things. Characters have to make moral decisions all the time, but you might also think of the Upside Down as Carl Jung's collective shadow, a place that represents and manifests the darkest versions of all humanity as one, buried deep in our unconsciousness. In Season 1, the kids refer to the Upside Down, which is actually written in the script as the Nether, as the Veil of Shadows. And the Dungeons & Dragons guidebook describes it as a dimension that is a dark reflection or echo of our world. But as the show develops Vecna, the Upside Down may also be a dark reflection of the characters themselves, which leads me to my next theme, consciousness. Many characters have so far had to confront external manifestations of their shadow selves, and I'm pretty confident Season 5 will force characters to confront internal ones. As a motif, in Seasons 2 and 3 and 4, Vecna/Mind Flayer uses unconsciousness to possess its victims. And the entire truth of who Vecna is buried in Eleven's unconscious memories that have to be dragged out and relived. To be honest, I don't know exactly where they're going with this, or if they're going anywhere intentionally, but there are a lot of references to Carl Jung's psychology where truth is embedded in our unconscious, and with Max in a coma and Will still eerily connected, it's bound to be huge next season. Guilt. Most characters in Stranger Things struggle with guilt. Nancy isn't over her role in Barb's death. Steve is racked with it in Season 1 after he's a jerk. Lucas felt like he could have done more for Max. Max wishes she could trade places with Billy, etc., etc., etc. Aside from being a recurring motif, though, I think guilt will prove to be the core theme of the show in Season 5, and here's why. Hopper feels immense guilt in Season 4 over many things, one of which is that due to his involvement in war, he's been exposed to Agent Orange, and he thinks that's why his daughter died. Agent Orange is a herbicide, a notoriously inhumane chemical weapon, and one of the most egregious war crimes since World War II. It's not the only war crime, though, referred to in Stranger Things. Vecna's dad, good old Victor Creel, confesses to Nancy that he accidentally ordered the shelling of a civilian home in World War II. Little Henry boy Vecna is so sickened by his dad's outward-facing presentation as a good person that he torments him with the image of a burning crib from that very home. Now, I don't know if Stranger Things will go down the war or nuclear weapons allegory route. It certainly could, given how much time they're spending with the Soviets, but it's certainly clear that guilt and accountability are major themes, as well as how do you reconcile that guilt. Vecna's understanding of justice is brutal punishment, but we've also seen characters like Steve come to hold themselves accountable through heartfelt apology. So we've just listed a few unpleasant things, the inevitability of time, evil, guilt, but look, all of those are conquerable through friendship, and friendship is a huge theme of the show. I hardly think it's a coincidence that Stranger Things is dripping in so many Lord of the Rings references. Tolkien, who served in the Western Front, triumphed friendship and love over horror and trauma in his stories, and we see the same here. When fighting Vecna in her own mind, Max uses warm memories of friendship. When Will is possessed, everyone again shares warm memories of friendship. Time and time again, characters seem done for and on their own until their friends show up to save them. So I have no doubt that friendship and sacrifice and trust are going to be how our characters triumph at the end of Season 5. So those were just 5 themes, and obviously that wasn't an exhaustive list at all. We could have also talked about masculinity and fatherhood, science as a potential for both good and evil, tunnels and the underground, use of fictional representation like Princess Daphne and D&D characters, but the main point is that it's certainly refreshing to have a show that uses symbols and motifs with clear thematic intention. But now to turn to the show's weaknesses and strengths. So, actually, really, I've addressed the main weaknesses when it comes to Stranger Things storytelling, but I do want to mention 2 quick things. 1, the real world. So, it's all very well and good to, for example, meet Joe Quinn and rewrite some portions of Eddie now that they've got a better idea of what Eddie will look and feel like. But as another example, Season 1 Steve was supposed to be way meaner and more hateable. That was the plan. And then they met Joe Keery and decided to make Steve charming, likable, and redeemed. And I love Steve, we all do, but Season 1 revolves around an idea of a character that just isn't really there because Steve is so charming and likable. It's like they edited one puzzle piece and forgot to adjust the rest of the puzzle around it. And a huge part of why the show is so successful commercially is by how well it's promoted through nostalgia, ad campaigns, and a really vibrant cast who are super generous with their time with fans. But I start to get nervous when I see things like polls from the official Stranger Things Twitter account about which ships are better. And I know they're not going to let us vote on who Nancy should end up with and actually honor that in the plot, but I do think that they build up ships to capitalize on ship culture. For those blissfully unaware, ship culture revolves around wanting certain characters to get together, basically. It's harmless and fun for the most part, but I hate to see manufactured ships, and I do think at times they're leaning into it, like with Steve and Nancy, or Stancy as they call it on social media. And to be clear, I am very grateful for the large part they don't sexualize their cast. Really, the only exception is Billy. It is hugely refreshing compared to other teen shows. Secondly, there is selective blindness in the whole premise of the show. Stranger Things wouldn't be Stranger Things if it weren't set in the 80s, but it's an escapist 80s where nostalgia for old Coke cans and Blondie takes precedence over the actual political context. And that's largely absolutely fine for the sake of story, but there are a few problematic stumbles when it comes to racism. I highly recommend the Black Cinephiles video on the show's failure to write black characters, which sheds light on recurring issues like the use of the sassy black woman stereotype. Thought Slime, as I've mentioned as well, also has a great video unpacking the liberal ideology in general, but with particular focus on a tellingly sloppy use of racism and, in Season 3, feminism. But we can criticize these failures and enjoy the show at the same time, so here are some of its greatest strengths that I haven't already mentioned. Trusting the audience. In lesser quality shows, if there are intelligent details, they're often shoved in our faces. In Stranger Things, they give us permission not to notice details because the details are just there to enhance the story, not carry it. For example, when Billy shows up at the end of Season 2, he slams Lucas into the wall in a nearly shot-by-shot replica of how his dad shoved him into the wall earlier in the episode. During that same fight scene, Steve gets the first punch in, but Billy recovers by grabbing a plate from the sink and slamming it into Steve's head. A full season later, Steve attacks a Soviet soldier, starts to lose the fight, but recovers by grabbing a phone from the desk and slamming it into the soldier's head. Rinse and repeat with Elle's fights with Vecna. These are things you really only notice during rewatches, and it's smart for them to leave behind crumbs like that to incentivize rewatching. It's not a subtle show at all, but they do include fun, subtle details, as well as myriad movie and cultural references. Secondly, technology. Strangely enough, it seems like the nostalgia effect is, if anything, heightened for people who didn't actually live through the 80s, maybe because of selective blindness. I imagine this is also, though, because we're all hyper-stimulated with data and technology, where every movement and thought of our lives is surveilled and recorded and marketed back to us. In contrast, the gentle simplicity of kids rolling dice in a basement without any iPhones or TikTok feels like a world that is irretrievably lost and magical. We might miss our childhoods and simultaneously realize that the childhoods we have and the ones depicted in the show are forever lost. In that sense, the Upside Down could maybe also speak towards a looming arrival of the new age of technology. The Duffers also openly admit that they use walkie-talkies for convenience. So Sometimes they work across huge distances, and sometimes they fail randomly when the plot needs them to. And you might think that's a cheap shortcut, but it's a clever writing trick, and since most of the show simply wouldn't happen in the 21st century, I think we're all comfortable suspending our disbelief when it comes to old school tech. Finally, imagination. A direct quote from the Stranger Things original pitch back when it was called Montauk. Quote, "When we were growing up, we were just regular kids living in the suburbs of North Carolina, playing Dungeons & Dragons with our nerdy friends. But when we watched these films and read these books, we felt transported. Suddenly, our lives had the potential for adventure. Maybe tomorrow we would find a treasure map in the attic. Maybe my brother would vanish into the TV. We really want to capture that feeling with Montauk. We want to bring that feeling to people who grow up on those films. And we also want to bring it to a whole new generation." So, there's plenty to complain about Stranger Things. It's not the perfect show, but I haven't found a single argument that suggests they didn't succeed in that lofty and admirable goal. Honestly, the way I feel about Stranger Things is pretty similar to the speech Will gives Mike in the back of the van in season 4, which is that, yeah, things are gonna fall apart. They're gonna spread out, they're not gonna add up well, it's gonna be somewhat messy from time to time, but the one thing that's gonna keep it all together is the show has great heart. And that's why I love this show so much, and I find it so refreshing. Out of all the content out there, Stranger Things really sticks out to me as somewhat of an epic like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. It's obviously not in the scope of Tolkien's work, it's not a huge masterpiece that will last for generations and generations, but it's the story that we've been craving for a while. We've got classic archetypes, we've got heroes and shadows, we've got one mega villain, and it's all been crafted over the course of many years, so people have gotten to know these characters. Whether you've seen them in one binge watch or you were at it from the start, Stranger Things really feels like a fixed cultural element now. And I know part of that is because they advertise so much on social media, I know that. And I do think sometimes it takes away from the purity of the story. But on the other hand, if it gets more people to watch, gets more people into fiction, into escapism, into fantasy, I'm all for it. So I am so glad this show exists, and I'm totally gonna keep rewatching it from time to time, even though I know its faults. And I cannot wait for season 5. I really do have enough faith in the writers that they are going to tie it all together in a way that feels good, and I'm really excited. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and if you have a disagreement or any strong thoughts, please go ahead and leave a comment. Streaming culture and binge watch model have a lot of issues, but if they can spark conversation, then we're gonna be fine. I used a handful of books in the making of this video, which I will leave in the description, along with links to the insightful videos on Stranger Things that I mentioned earlier. See you next time.